Welcome to today's Diálogo Noble. I am Aidea Costa, Chief College Officer for Noble. In the spirit of celebrating Latinx Heritage Month, today we are having a diálogo on the shifting meanings of ethnic labels and overall how we identify or are identified as people of Latin American origin living in the US. The borders of when and where Latin America begins and ends es una herida abierta, an open wound, as Gloria Ansaldúa stated. I am excited to have with me today Dr. Francisco Galarte and Dr. Rachel Gonzalez join me in this diálogo. Dr. Galarte and Dr. Gonzalez are experts in the field of Latina, Latino, Latinx studies. I am proud to call them my colleagues, but also my dear friends. I made frank while we both studied abroad in Mexico City and reconnected as graduate students at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign while we were doctoral students. Rachel was the first friend I made when I was at Indiana University Bloomington as a visiting assistant professor. We have spent many years thinking about culture and identity, and I am very excited to share a diálogo with my colegas and also with you today. So I'm going to pass it on. Rachel, you can start by introducing yourself.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Dr. Rachel Gonzalez. Where do I start? I'm an associate professor of Latino, Latina, Latinx studies at the University of Texas at Austin. Let's see, I was born and raised in California, and I'm a folklorist. And that means that I study the everyday art and culture of what we consider Latinx communities. And my most recent book is about quinceañera traditions, and particularly this idea of quinceañera style, particularly the style that young women employ to make themselves visible as grown-up women, young adults in the Latinx community, as American citizens.
Great, thank you, and welcome to this diálogo.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. Frank, do you want to go next?
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Aide, and thank you, Rachel, for being such great company. My name is Dr. Francisco Galarte. I am an assistant professor at the University of New Mexico, and my appointment is in the Department of American Studies and the Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies program. My most recent book and work that is forthcoming in January is called Brown Transfigurations, and my work, the work that I do, is very much situated in understanding trans experience in relationship to Chicanx, Latinx culture. And so I'm interested in bringing those two connections together to really kind of bring visibility to the trans Latinx community and how we've persisted over time.
Wonderful. What a treat for us today. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you identify and, if you want to elaborate a little bit on your own experiences as well? We can start with you, Frank, since we ended there.
Okay, so I identify as a trans Chicano, sometimes trans Chicanx. Really kind of varies in terms of where I am in the world. If I'm with other members of the LGBT community, then Chicanx is the term that I'm going to use. I'm also identify as a fronterizo. I grew up on the US-Mexico border in a very small town called Brawley. So living in the borderlands is something that really defines who I am. I moved away from the borderlands to the Los Angeles area, Orange County area, to go to undergrad. And then from there, I went to the Midwest, to the University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana for my doctoral work. And that's where the Midwest and Latino and Latinx identity really kind of came to bear on my understanding of what it meant to be a fronterizo and a Chicano. I also transitioned, identify as trans in the Midwest. And so being in this middle place in the US, again, also informed my identity. And then later moved to Arizona, back to the borderlands for my first job as a professor. And now I find myself in New Mexico, which has also really kind of pushed my understanding around the terminology that we're talking about today, which is Chicana, Chicano, Chicanx, Latino, Latina, Latinx, and Hispanic and Hispano are terms that I've come to learn a lot more about in terms of how I understand these labels and markers. So that's a little bit about myself.
Yeah, I'll jump in here because so much of what Frank was saying resonates so much with my own experiences, not only because my grandmother was born and raised in Brawley as well.
Mm.
So we have some connection.
Hmm.
So I was actually raised in the San Francisco Bay Area, particularly in Oakland, California, which again, if we're thinking about where people live and the other communities that are butting up against us, we think about how our identities are really relative, right? They're connected to who's around us. My parents are Chicanos, Chicano and Chicana. Both my parents identify that way. And being slightly headstrong young woman, I actively resisted wanting to identify with Chicano and Chicana culture, or even just the term. It didn't feel right for me. So growing up in the Bay Area, I didn't necessarily go to school with a lot of other Chicano and Chicanx youth. I mostly hung out around African Americans and Asian Americans. So Chicano and Chicana didn't even resonate. Like I wasn't even separating myself from a community around me. It just wasn't there. So in some cases, when I was, a little kid, I was either white or black, right? So even fitting into that binary was difficult. But when I started to go to college, I went to UC Berkeley, still in California, still in the Bay Area. The term that everyone was really using was Mexican American, right? It was very clear, oh, Mexican American, and that resonated. Because one, I felt like I didn't assume I could speak Spanish, which I can, but I'm not a heritage speaker. And within the Latinx community more broadly, there's some lines that we think about when we think about the terms we use for ourselves relative to what languages we speak or what languages dominate our experiences. But like Frank, thinking about where you were living, I also went to graduate school in the Midwest. I have a doctorate from Indiana University. And being in Indiana, when I said what I got used to when I was a kid saying, oh, I'm Mexican, everyone assumed I was Mexican American. No one assumed I was an international student. That changed when I went to graduate school. And I would say, oh, I'm Mexican. And they're like, you speak English so well. And I was like, thanks, I do. And I was like, wait a minute. So just understanding that the way that I was expressing myself was giving people the wrong idea, not necessarily because of racism per se, but it just wasn't clear. It wasn't clear from where we were that people were identifying in this way. And it wasn't until probably second or third year in Southern Indiana that I found that Latina was sort of the way to go. It was the most inclusive. There weren't a lot of other Mexican students, Mexican American students, Chicanx students at all. Forget the X, Chicano students. And so Latino, Latina became a term that I could really get comfy underneath and have a community.
This is great. Just I'm thinking especially like your individual experiences and then how they intersect and when with the Midwest, right? And the reality of our lives more broadly. So this is amazing. So tell me a little bit more, from the work that you're doing and the research that you have done, like what's the big buzz now, right? There's a lot coming out about these different ethnic labels, people either embracing, rejecting, and there overall just a lot of conversations, particularly around Latinx and what it means today. Could you talk to us a little bit more about the meaning and shifting of these different ethnic labels? We can start with you, Rachel.
Sure. So this is interesting. So my work is ethnographic. So I do ethnographic fieldwork. So I go in and I'm speaking to actual community members. I'm connecting, I'm building relationships. And so even though I was researching quinceañera celebrations all across the country, and particularly in the Midwest for many years, I hadn't heard the term Latinx was not being thrown around. It wasn't actually until I started teaching at the University of Texas that students in particular started using the X in course writing. And I actually, the first few times I saw it, I circled it with a red pen and said, is this a typo? And I think they thought I was being political, but I really wasn't. I just hadn't seen it in print just yet. And it was sort of right on the cusp of when I think the term was moving from the spaces where it was being sort of built organically. So the first place that I saw the term Latina, or I saw the X being used in Spanish language writing, was through a collaborator of mine, a wonderful friend who's a mujer trans, a trans performer in Mexico City who performs as a quinceañera. But her work as a trans activist meant that she was very aware, right, of how things like protest signage needed to speak from the community that it was coming from. And she's like, you know, we are not a community of A or O. And so the X was what people were using. And so I was like, oh, okay. So part of this idea of working in community meant I was working and deferring to my community, right? And thinking about how people were identifying. So I think for me, that's very important. As someone that works with a community and sees my writing within my academic career as really dependent, beholden, and responsible to the community narratives, I'm never gonna identify people without asking them. And so I have to be a little bit more cautious. But I definitely think we have to sort of, I think the conversation around Latinx is complicated because there's so many layers to our identities, historically, regionally, age-wise, gender-wise, all manner of layers of identity get put upon us, right? And I think it's really telling that even at this point in our American experience, we're still debating terms. And when I tell my undergraduates, I tell them, you know, in a lot of ways, these terms need to be as flexible as the communities using them. In that terms in general, particularly those that come down from, you know, governmental institutions or appear on things like the census or in, you know, school rosters, right? We have to sort of understand that those are organizational terms. They're trying to put us under one umbrella, maybe to count us. Some might say to control us or control market base. There's all sorts of narratives around how terms control people, but we can also control those terms. And so for me, thinking about seeing these terms and their use, it's really about understanding where people are coming from. So it's like, I think that the debate around Latinx, even though people have some really fervent ideas one way or the other, for me, it's all about the conversation that comes, not from changing someone's mind, but from asking them where their perspective is coming from, right?
Thank you, Rachel. Frank?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think for me, the first time that I saw Latinx or encountered it was students in my classes, definitely when I was teaching, definitely not in my scholarship. I was writing my dissertation on transgender Chicana, Chicano, Chicanx folks. And so I heard this from my student and then started seeing it kind of pop up on social media. And, you know, as someone who was doing scholarship when we were using the @ sign to kind of capture the gender neutrality that I think that the X is trying to get at, it came to my attention, of course, as someone who is trans and writes within transgender studies and Chicano, Chicanx, Latina, Latino, Latinx studies. Something capacious, something that has room, like the X, seems really appealing. But at the same time, as I do the work that I do by looking at cultural text and doing some archival work, you know, there's a limit to what the X can do for folks who lived at a time when we didn't have that sleight of language, right? But then also, in terms of a term for the term Latinx, what it means or what it does today, I think that it really gets at capturing the experience of folks who identify as non-binary. And folks who identify as non-binary are folks who do not identify with, you know, male or female exclusively on one side of the binary or the other. And so we don't have a term in Spanish really that kind of gets at that. And so, you know, really learning from folks who identify as non-binary and trans who want to do away with the constraints that the binary puts on them. And those constraints happen at multiple levels, right? So we're not just talking about interpersonally, if you get someone's pronouns wrong, which is a big deal, which you should always try to get their pronouns right, ask first before you use a pronoun. But it also means that at the level of getting identification, getting a driver's license, signing up for healthcare benefits, right? All of that includes having to put down a marker for your sex and your gender. And so trans people and non-binary people are always kind of subject to that scrutiny that folks who identify with the gender that they were assigned at birth don't necessarily have to grapple with. So I think that the X becomes a term to really kind of get at folks who are not trans or non-binary. It's a way to show solidarity and to really not further enact the wounds or the trauma of trans and non-binary people who have to really grapple with presenting their gender every single day in a way that is intelligible to people who are not trans and who are not non-binary, right? So Latinx isn't just about, making room within language. It's about changing our practices when it comes to how we think about gender in our culture as Chicanx, Latinx folks, right? We can't, it reminds us that we shouldn't take gender as a given, I think, and really kind of expanding who fits into the categories of male or female, or, really comes through can come through in the use of the X, right? Expanding what counts as feminine and masculine and detaching that from what it means to be a man or to be a woman. And then at the same time, also respecting and understanding there's folks who don't care to fit into those categories, and it's not individually, it's not our job to put them in a category that makes sense to us. It's to, as Rachel mentioned, right, ask, what is a term or terminology that's going to get at someone's racial and kind of gendered experience. And so for me, those are the thoughts that I have about like the term and kind of the meaning of the X and its usefulness. It's not about imposing a way to speak or talk about ethnicity or gender, but rather a way to continue to learn and to really be open to the fact that race, gender, sexuality are things that continue to change and to evolve.
I was going to add, if that's okay. Is it okay?
Please do.
That this is really interesting to think about, because so many times when I have conversations, particularly with people who are old, who are of an older generation, maybe my parents' age, there's a certain defensiveness that comes with saying Latinx and wanting them to sort of catch up with how we're using terms in the community right now. And I feel like they forget that terms have been changing consistently, right? The idea of the legibility of something like Hispanic, which still in Texas is very popular. And coming here from the Midwest and having been raised in California, having to respect students who actively identify as Hispanic and don't see themselves as even Latino or Latina or Mexican American. And so that kind of adjustment, right, a kind of regional and age-based adjustment is necessary. But I'll share that the last class I taught at UT last semester had a majority of they, them, non-binary identifying students. Meaning I had more students who were saying, I'm not really, I don't know, I'm still working on my pronouns, but I don't necessarily just identify along this gender binary. And so the idea of the X wasn't necessarily about, okay, you can all be under an X and someone else can be under an A and an O, but the conversation about creating inclusive language and even just the idea of the openness of a conversation, right? Not erasing someone's experience and saying, yeah, you're fine. Everyone's, the O includes you, or the OA includes you. And rather than diminishing those experiences, saying, okay, what are we gonna do? And we actually had a class discussion. So I was like, okay, let's talk about how you see the X working. And unanimously, generationally, it kind of makes sense. Everyone was on board with being included in the X, rather than saying, well, and I would have switched it around as necessary, right? But really being aware and actually making time for those conversations. And I think that's more and more pronounced as we think about intergenerational relationships. If you're a parent or a grandparent who actively negates the term, you don't even really know maybe if your son or daughter or child is feeling any kind of trepidation around gender performativity or gender identity or just how they're feeling about themselves. You could be erasing a conversation that you'd have with them, right, where they feel comfortable and safe in their own home. And so thinking a little bit about not so much, I think it's really important that people understand there's a difference between wanting to create a collective vocabulary that includes as many people potentially as possible, that's not perfect, versus I personally identifying, right? What word you use for yourself. And so I think that's something, particularly in the classroom, that can be really useful. right?
Yeah, that's great, Rachel, and especially very relevant, as we serve a diverse population in Chicago, right? Not just in terms of students, but our staff are also very diverse in their own identities and how they identify. We have a couple of minutes left. I'm going to put you on your professor expertise on being able to summarize and bring everything together. So could you just in the last couple of minutes summarize for us the difference of these labels to begin with? Because there's a lot of confusion, right? We spent some time talking about Latinx, but where does Hispanic come from? Where does Latina, Latino? And you talked a little bit about, your parents identifying as Chicana, Chicano, Frank, as well for yourself. So yeah, bring it back together. Like, what does this mean as we're, sharing this back with our staff and also our students?
Sure. Frank, you want to start or should I?
I can start a little bit. Yeah, I mean, I think to go back where you ended off with your students, a lot of them identifying as Hispanic in Texas. That's what I've encountered both in Arizona and New Mexico to a certain extent, and really kind of having students learn and read about the origins of Hispanic as a term that has been used exclusively by the government to quantify, which you've already touched on. I think that history becomes important, but also the fact that in parts of the United States, it's a term that captures a particular experience and history of a population. And, for Latina, Latino, that is a term that I myself really saw used a lot more in the Midwest, especially in Chicago, when I was teaching students who were Puerto Rican and Mexican. So Latina, Latino was a term that folks really felt that spoke to their identity as opposed to going back to solely identifying along kind of ethnic background, which is a lot of students did too, right? So terms like Mexican American, are terms that generation probably before us used more exclusively. And Mexican is probably a term that a lot more folks recently migrated and have more close ties to that type of nationalist identity and living in the United States as immigrants kind of gets to that. And then to summarize, back to Latinx and kind of the turn towards that inclusivity of the terms. I think the usage of the X magnifies how at this particular moment, this generation is calling towards us to really grapple with gender and sexuality in a way that it hasn't previously.
Yeah, I really agree with everything that Frank is saying. And sort of to take a sort of a different angle on that, right? Thinking a little bit about terms like Hispanic that are linked to Spain, that are linked to colonial relationships with the Americas broadly, and people resisting that and saying, maybe that's not my primary identity. Understanding, right, at a certain political moment during the Chicano movement, 60s and 70s, we're talking about the development of community-based identity markers. Not perfect, but people were looking for a change, right? They were being motivated to accentuate different sides of their heritage through different terminology. And so you get another round of terms. And so with Chicano and then the feminine Chicana, and now Chicanx, right? We see kind of this wiggle room with terms that we don't want to lose, but we need to modify, right? We're not stagnant. The terms aren't stagnant. Our communities aren't stagnant. But then I would say the pushback or the response to Hispanic, Chicano, Chicana was this, again, the larger umbrella, Latino, Latina, Latinx now, which again it's sort of a mixed bag. On some level, we can think about the ways in which, yes, it's turning us into a quantifiable marketplace in the United States, right? It kind of asks people to distill down their identity in some way, and it still has gaps, right? We're not giving proper recognition to indigenous communities and indigenous migrants. We're not really giving enough attention to Afro-Latinx communities or those who identify as negro or negra or don't feel like they cannot identify in that way. And so, but it's a work in progress. So when I think about terms like Latinx, I think we need to weigh our responses to it. So if you think, you watch your grandma, your grandpa, your dad, or your teacher, whoever, really get fired up about how much Latinx isn't correct, maybe it's not about being 100% accurate, because nothing is, but we're thinking about the affective quality. What would it mean, even if it's a little bit muddled, to say that the goal of, let's say, the group conversation that you're moderating is to include everyone, right? So I think on some level for me, thinking about how terms change, I think our community is going in a good direction if what we're trying to do is say, is claiming all of those who want to be part of that community.
And if I could add on really quickly, just this brings to mind, the idea. So as we were talking about like terms like Hispanic, right? Like in terms that, and this is a term that like you, Rachel, as you mentioned, signals a particular colonial, anti-Indigenous, anti-Black history, right? Like when we're making choices about their terms, I think part of the due diligence is to really kind of ask questions about the origins of where those terms come from, which is a responsibility that I don't think we always acknowledge and can be quite pedagogical. If it's in the classroom, if it's with your peers, it's doing that work to really kind of, understand where these terms come from, how they circulate, and the impact of those circulation of folks who are excluded by those terms. And that would be folks who are, sometimes that's folks who are Latinx and Black, Latinx and Indigenous, and have those histories and is a part of, who they are and how they move through the world.
And one thing to add, thinking about being professors and teachers, right? The idea of being willing to be wrong, right? Being able to say, sort of laying out the cards, being transparent. I know that I use Latinx for the title, in the title of my book. And to me, that was really important because there was enough folks who I talked to, who are my friends, who are my collaborators, who identified as queer, who have identified as gay or lesbian or trans, that I wasn't gonna erase their identities so my cover could have an O or an A or an extra letter. But part of that is saying, you spend a little extra time saying, this is why I'm doing that. You may not agree with it, but again, here are my goals. Now, in 20 years, it might look really different and that might look really dated. But to understand that at the point that you're having your conversation now, thinking about what are you trying to do in this moment with the acknowledgement that things might change. And that's okay. That ambivalence is something I think that as a larger community, we kind of have in common. If one thing we have in common across Latinx identities is that in the United States, our identities are kind of always changing, either by our own choices or they're changing around us. And so we have to be sort of light on our feet and flexible, particularly with language.
I love that, Rachel, in bringing it all back on this idea of ambivalence, right? That is our shared experience, that our experiences are not monolithic, be it geographical, be it linguistic, racial identities, and so on. So we live in this ambivalence and trying to come up, right, with how to categorize a whole community is really challenging. But picking up on what both you said, as educators, we do have that dual diligence to ask where these terms come from, hence why we're having this diálogo, as you both also stated. Especially we work with high school students, right? I think the three of us would probably agree that we went, our educational experiences in the American educational system didn't really necessarily relate to our experiences, how we identified and how we saw ourselves. And that needs to change and that needs to shift. And that is the work that we're trying to lead at Noble. And part of why I really wanted to engage in this conversation is, as our organization is also making a claim to becoming an anti-racist organization, to do the hard work of getting us there, means that we have to have a critical discussion on what these categories mean, what they have meaning for our populations, but how also we use them. So I really appreciated your time today to, participate in this diálogo, contribute with your own experiences, your own research experiences on how these labels have shifted. So I appreciate your time. And the last thing I wanted to say before, and I'll pass it back if you want some concluding thoughts. When I jumped in, I didn't introduce myself deliberately. I wanted to have, you both lead this dialogue, but, for those that are wondering, I do, I don't believe also in a category that's fixed in time or place. It shifts with experiences. I came to the US when I was 6, 7 years old, went through the American educational system. That has, that in itself gives you a particular lens. In Southern California, and moved to the Midwest when for graduate school, where I met Frank, and later I met Rachel at Indiana when I taught at Indiana University, and have identified, Mexicana, Chicana when I started college, and then embraced being Latina when I arrived to the Midwest. And although generationally I have a different experience from the students we serve, all our year we have to be open to how we're being pushed, to the point you made, Frank, as well, how this generation is pushing us to really grapple with these identities, with gender, with sexuality, and we have to be open to supporting them. So thank you for your time. One last thought or concluding?
No, thank you for having us.
Yes, thank you so much for having us.
Thank you. This was a pleasure. To be continued, more diálogos. Thank you for your time.